Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to the Nationalmusée. Thank you for being so many tonight. I am very happy to introduce to you Vera Herold. She will have a talk about Who Remembers What? Polyphonic Memories of the Carnation Revolution. And just as a quick word of introduction about Vera, so she holds an FCT from the an FCT scholarship, so the Facultad de Ciencias Humanas. Sorry for my Portuguese pronunciation. She's currently working on her PhD dissertation in culture studies at the Lisbon Consortium and the Graduate Center for the Study of Culture at the Justus Liebig Universität in Gießen. Her research is focused on the memories of the German community living in Lisbon during the 1930s and 1940s, and on how they relate to historiographic discourse and the European cultural memory narrative. She is general coordinator of the Cine project at the Cinemateca Portuguesa, Museu do Cinema, and works freelance as a translator and as a specialist guide here at the museum. Her research interests include memory and archive, migration and translation, literary translation, and film education. So her talk tonight fits very well into that. I also have to mention that we are very grateful and thankful to Vera for helping us a lot during the coming together of our exhibition on the revolution, because she helped us a lot with the Portuguese translations, and she helped us translate since Regis Meuse and I were not fluent in Portuguese, so we are very grateful for her help. So I can only give the word to Vera, and I hope that you have a nice evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for coming. I also want to thank the museum, and especially Regis and Isabel, for accepting my proposal for this talk. I want to thank the Service du Public and Tanya for always finding a slot and more general making room for my proposals. I must warn you and make a disclaimer, because I think in some respects I'm way out of my depth here. And I know I have literary scholars sitting in the audience. I'm not a historian. I'm not an art historian. I'm not a literary scholar or film scholar. And yet I will be talking about films and literature and artworks against a historical background. I will also mention some music, and you've guessed it, I'm not a musicologist either. What I know and have researched a lot over the last years is cultural memory. How does memory work, and what does it do to that what history does not know? How is memory deployed in cultural objects, and how do these objects impact us? And one last remark. Despite not being in an academic setting, I want to acknowledge the main authors and literary scholars that have informed this keynote and on which I have drawn, but that I will not quote directly: Paulo de Medeiros, Ana Paula Ferreira, Helena Kaufmann, and Margarida Calafate, among others. The film you saw at the start is a 2017 film essay by Susana Sousa Dias called Luz Obscura, Obscure Light. It shows in a compelling way how the persecution of Portugal's political police, the PIDE-DGS, impacted the intimate sphere of a family and molded their lives. Through the memories of three siblings, we are made familiar with the suffering of Álvaro, Isabel, and Rui Pato during the years in the underground with their father Otávio Pato and his wife and biological mother of Rui, Albina Fernandes. The children's longing for the outside, to have friends and extended family during the years spent in the underground resistant. Later, worse, the imprisonment of their parents, life with their paternal grandparents, and the painful prison visits. Both parents were beaten up and tortured for days and served long prison sentences. Otávio's oldest brother, Carlos, had died 10 years earlier after weeks of atrocious suffering at the hands of the torturers. Haunted by her memories of torture, Albina Fernandes would commit suicide in 1970, 2 years after being released. Álvaro, the oldest sibling, followed his father's footsteps, joined the Communist Party and refused to be drafted, going into hiding as well. He was denounced, arrested and tortured in May 1973 and released 2 days after the revolution on April 27, 1974. Maria Rodrigues Pato, the grandmother, visited sons, daughters-in-law and grandchildren in prison for 25 years, from 1949 to 1974. All this is documented and knowable through newspapers, articles, documentaries, on the internet. So what does this art documentary tell us, this film essay, that we cannot know otherwise? There are the images that emerge from a stormy Black Sea, which you saw, and that mirrors not just the emotional turmoil of the families witnessing, but a sense of danger. There is the truth in the voice of the accounts of the 3 siblings, the long silences, hesitations, that were not edited out and reveal as much as the memories they evoke. Silence is very important in memory. We witness the pain of remembering, the loneliness, hardship, and suffering. The way memory works is like putting together a puzzle whose pieces are always not enough or too many. They never give a clear message. The film respects and reflects this process of remembering, and rather than editing out these silences into a well-paced discourse, as for a TV documentary, to be fitted into a 30-minute format with some pathos to reel in the spectator's attention. Here we witness the witnesses are given space and time, and we witness the remembering itself. Each image lingers, the photos of Albina with the 2 smaller children in the prison yard, the details revealed in close-ups, the mugshots, the contemporary images of the ruins of the grandparents' house where all children of the family grew up. The account tells us she was arrested with the 2 children, whose hands she is said to have held night and day for 25 days in her prison cell, until she could personally hand them over to her parents-in-law, making sure they were not taken by anyone else. The close-ups that we show in the film, they are from the film, I didn't make the close-ups. They draw our attention to details that complete the accounts and depict the violence of Albina's imprisonment. She is wearing house slippers on the prison yard. She was probably wearing them when she was taken from her house. The children have proper shoes. By now, they only come to visit. By 2024, 7 years after the film was premiered, the stories of this film essay have found their way into the mainstream and been incorporated in new interviews for documentaries and museum texts for the 50th anniversary. These new accounts are atrocious, but the weight and depth of Luz Obscura are not carried over. Only the film conveys, for example, the sense of claustrophobia in the lives of these children, or the fact that the film uses the family as its main topic when the family was one of the tenets of Salazar's ideology, Deus, Patria, Familia, only comes through in this film. It therefore stands for this extraordinary, brave communist family, but also represents the thousands of familial bonds the dictatorship destroyed or did not uphold and cherished as it should. And because of political persecution, extreme poverty, the colonial war after 1961, it all resulted in an increasing lack of future for the following generations. So this, I hope, has set the stage for tonight's topic. Who remembers what? Polyphonic memories of the Carnation Revolution. But what is memory and what is polyphony? Well, polyphony is easy. It's easy to explain. The expression comes from music and describes the kind of music that instead of having everyone sing and play at the same time, more or less the same thing, each voice or instrument does their own thing, and the whole, hopefully, at the end makes sense and sounds good. Transposed to the conceptual and political realm, polyphony means a complex, hard to navigate, and excited chorus of voices that coexist, as opposed to a single view of polarization. I will play a very short extract from a musical work that is a reflection on the Carnation Revolution, 24 years later. It is the opera by contemporary composer António Pinho Vargas, and was commissioned in the framework of a festival preceding Expo 98, so it's from 1998, 1 year before the 25th anniversary of the revolution. When it was premiered in the presence of various government officials, there was a certain disappointment. A more celebratory work and glorious work was expected. And the opera lends itself to that, of course, as a medium. Instead, a more pensive and philosophical work was presented, more interesting too, with room for different ways to feel about the revolutionary process. The opera ends with several simultaneous musings on the events that were just witnessed in the opera. So now, this will hopefully work. And I will... And there's a short explanation. So interesting is the fact that Pinho Vargas said when presenting the opera in the foyer of the São Carlos Theatre in Lisbon, that in order to know what the revolution had been, the opera would never replace a history book. But 6 years later, when launching the CD in the same foyer, he admitted he had been wrong. It was in the opera that you could see and feel what it all was like, from the time before until the normalization of the revolution in November 1975. This ability of art, music and literature and film to capture an intangible truth. Now, a few words on memory, specifically on cultural memory. Pierre Norat's Lieu de Mémoire. Pierre Norat's Lieu de Mémoire is a 1984 compilation of French sites of memory. And this is the first important work on cultural memory. Though a crucial step, it has been revised various times in the meantime to better grasp the concept of cultural memory. The main critique to Norat's concept is that it presupposes an agreement about what and how to remember. His lieux de mémoire are monuments and museums, but also people and symbols, and they reflected, of course, a view of what was worth remembering. New and more flexible concepts were developed later that avoid, for example, linking memory to a given nation, or the presupposition everyone in that nation shares the same memories. We know that no two people remember anything the exact same way, let alone millions. Imagine a group of people gathering around a war memorial, men, women, different generations, backgrounds, and personal stories, different nationalities and migration backgrounds. They will not be thinking and feeling the same way. What we remember is influenced by our past and our present, our circumstances now and then. Later, Michael Rothbard, an important memory scholar, proposed memory knots, nœuds de mémoire instead of lieux de mémoire. An image with enough space and complexity for multiple memories that can be contradictory, even challenge each other. And with this more complex and pluralistic notion of memory is the one with which culture studies, memory studies work nowadays. So this is what memory might look like. After the Carnation Revolution and the end of censorship, there was a cultural explosion. The first thing that happened was that previously censored works flooded the scene. This was particularly noticeable in cinema. At the time, films could only be enjoyed in cinemas, so it was very difficult to escape censorship. During the 15 years or so following the revolution, we had the most extraordinary film programming in film clubs, the Cinematheque, and in commercial cinemas. One previously censored filmmaker after the other was presented to us. Visconti, Rossellini, Pasolini, Buñuel, Godard, Kubrick, Hitchcock, Fassbender. It was a feast. At the same time, national production of moving images also exploded. The freedom to capture and show any image, the impressive imagery of the revolutionary process, fired the imagination. The images captured then stir our memory and our imagination to this day. Luciana Fina is an Italian filmmaker, artist, curator, and researcher from Bari, but who has been living in Lisbon since 1991. For this year's anniversary of the revolution, she created for the Cinemateca Portuguesa an installation of which this film is part. To her, fiction and documentary filmmakers and cameramen created, what she says, complex filmic objects that are poetic, neo-realistic and realistic, anthropological or fictional representation of the process. They are very singular and vigorous gestures that today form a rich cinematographic legacy. With her deep knowledge of Portuguese cinema and the holdings of the archive, she created, together with archives of the Portuguese national broadcaster RTP, a 107-minute-long collage of dozens of moving images from TV documentaries and newsreels to extracts of fiction films from before and after the revolution. Sempre, a palavra e o sonho na rua, always the word and the dream on the streets, has now an afterlife in its own right and was selected for the section Venetian Nights of this year's Venice Film Festival. It will also open the International Documentary Film Festival in DOC Lisboa. And I will show you a little bit. Hopefully this will work with sound.
A toda a parte chegam os vampiros, poisam nos prédios, poisam nas calçadas, trazem no ventre despojos antigos, mas nada os prende às vidas acabadas. Se quiseres, podes deixar de fazer as coisas. São os mordomos do universo todo, senhores à força, mandadores sem lei, enchem as tulhas, bebem vinho novo, dançam a ronda no pinhal do rei.
Uma assembleia.
Now listen, there are some interferences. Listen closely.
Eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo e não deixam nada. Eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo e não deixam nada.
Ok, então nesse caso, estamos só de uma hora para filmar, já está.
No chão do medo tombam os vencidos, ouvem-se os gritos na noite abafada, jazem nos fossos vítimas de um credo e não se esgota o sangue da manada. Se alguém se engana com seu ar sisudo e lhes franqueia as portas à chegada, eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo e não deixam nada. Eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo, eles comem tudo e não deixam nada.
Vai começar em 5 minutos no pátio do edifício. Tem que falar lá fora.
So, if you listened carefully, you saw that there's a different sound that starts disturbing the song. So we have an overlap of a 1963 song by Zeca Afonso, The Vampires, an open critique to the dictatorship and exploitation of the masses by a few. But at the same time, in the back, voices that belong to a contemporary struggle, climate action. At the end of the sequence, the image eventually reveals that. So memory looks back, but it always already looks forward too, into the future, like the Roman god Janus, who we love to use for this. He is often depicted with old Janus looking back and young Janus looking forward. I like these depictions because they reflect the intergenerational nature of memory. So memory is not a return to the same. As Fina says about her film, it is rather, here. It is rather something that restitutes the possibility of what was. What seems to be at stake is the possibility of making the finished unfinished again, to glean the suspended image, allow what has passed to reinvent itself, relaunching the possibility or the right to imagine a future. Apart from the political persecution, the other big trauma is Portugal's colonial past, namely the war. António Lobo Antunes, a renowned Portuguese psychiatrist and famous writer, penned the novel that opened the door to a literary reckoning with the colonial war, Os Cus de Judas, The Land at the End of the World. There is no suitable translation for the Portuguese title. It's an eschatological title that refers to the anus of Judas, and it means the back of beyond, a remote and often God-forsaken place. Published in 1979, it is the first great novel about the colonial war, its violence and trauma that the narrator calls a slow apprenticeship in dying. It garnered Lobo Antunes the comparison with the likes of Tolstoy. The author draws on his own experience as a medic in the colonial war, as well as on the traumatic aftermath of his return. In his words, a very personal vision of hell. We find the narrator in a Lisbon bar in the late 1970s, a drunken night bound to end in one more meaningless sexual encounter. In a long monologue, the narrator describes to his listening woman the war in a land that is not ours, the malaria and the bullets. In his words, the fighting an invisible enemy, fighting the endless days that never pass, fighting homesickness, indignation, and remorse, fighting the dark nights as thick and opaque as a mourning veil. But he also dreads coming home. It makes my throat tighten because, you see, I have no place anywhere. I went too far away for too long, ever to belong here again. To these autumns of rain and Sunday masses, these long winters as dull as blown light bulbs, these faces I can barely recognize. To him, the plane that returns the soldiers to Lisbon after 27 months in hell is a cargo of ghosts that slowly materialize. And Lisbon, his home city, feels unhospitable. Os Cus de Judas is an extraordinary cathartic exercise in memory, in which Lobo Antunes' literary language and style successfully convey the violence and desperation of the colonial war in Angola, as well as the trauma that haunted the Portuguese veterans for decades. The status of ex-combatant, and with it the access to the necessary medical treatments, for example, was signed into law in 1999, 25 years after the last soldiers came back. Now, these soldiers were victims as well as perpetrators. They killed, they participated in, or stood by the massacres and violence against civilians in the ex-colonies. At the same time, they were themselves victims of the guerrilla warfare waged by the liberation armies, and, more relevant to the point I want to make, they were victims of the regime who conscripted them to defend an empire no longer defendable. Now, almost 10 years later, a woman tackles the colonial war. Lídia Jorge publishes in 1988 A Costa dos Murmúrios, The Murmuring Coast. It renders a sophisticated account of the impact of the colonial war on both contemporary and colonial society decades on. The novel starts with a 30-page short story, Os Gafanhotos, The Locusts, narrating a sumptuous wedding reception on the terrace of the top floor of the Hotel Stella Maris in the city Beira. The setting, with a view of the Indic Ocean, represented, in the words of a guest, an excess of happiness and beauty. Evita, the bride, had arrived from Lisbon the day before to marry the officer, an ex-mathematics student, Luís Alex, the groom. They had dated in Lisbon before he was drafted and was now deployed in the north of the country, with the Viriamu massacre in the background, unnamed but recognizable, that wiped out the civilian population of the village. The short story sets the stage for what follows. The narrator reveals an intimate knowledge, the narrator of the short story, reveals an intimate knowledge of the different characters on the terrace, but it is limited to that white colonial microcosm. The short story then ends tragically with a shot below in the city and the discovery of the groom's dead body. The remaining 220 pages are the reaction of the short story and an account by Eva Lopo 20 years later. It starts, "This is a charming account. I read it carefully and I concluded that everything in it is exact and true," said Eva Lopo. Further on, you clarified what you set out to clarify, and what you wanted to hide remained submersed. Eva Lopo adds to the short story with details, context, uncovering what had remained hidden. She explains the death of the groom and the mysterious death of dozens of black men who were being poisoned with methanol and whose bodies were washed up by the sea. She introduces subplots and contradicts and teases the author of the short story, who we soon learn is a man, and she explains things to him. The short story represents the male official account of the army and the state, while the monologue adds a more complex female perspective that represents all those affected by the violence of the war without being directly involved in the fighting. Eva Lopo knows everything. She was there, she witnessed the transformation of Luis Alex into a violent man who takes sadistic pleasure and pride in the massacres he participates in, and the gratuitous killing of animals. The account, there are photos she has seen that were later destroyed. This account, while not historically true regarding what happened in Mozambique, brings a different truth by undermining the official myths of the short story with other stories. Although she is white and married to an officer turned war criminal, Eva Lopo identifies with the subaltern, with the underdog, those who did not make but suffered history. That also includes the white women living behind the scenes of war at the Stella Maris or in highly securitized and surveilled villas. And it includes the children as well as the black African under colonial rule. Georges' approach is very different from that of Lobo and Tunis. Both use memory to recall the events of war. Their purpose and their effect are very different, though. Lobo and Tunis' cathartic exercise of memory is a confessional first-person account that tells us how it was and how it felt. Despite the anti-war feeling and message of the novel, it nevertheless seems to replicate and therefore perpetuate the violence of war the novel sets out to denounce. Lydia Georges, on the other hand, confronts us with the ripples and the murmurings of this violence. She does so with irony. For example, the killing of the groom. In the short story, he follows a black reporter who had taken a picture from the terrace. And of course, taking pictures in this context of the pictures of the Viriamu massacre it's a metaphor for the Viriamu pictures. A shot, he follows him, and the shot is heard in the distance. And one of the guests ventures that the groom probably just fired a warning shot. The commander knows and replies and justifies, "Oh, it was an excessive act by the officer, a man used to the counter-subversion in the field," making a cynical exculpation and normalizing violence. Ironically, it is the groom who is found dead, shot in the forehead by his own hand. Even more ironical is the fact that the black reporter was Evita's lover and is challenged by the groom to a Russian roulette game. And that is how the groom died. And the short story ends with this last sentence. So everyone, including Evita, understood that the excess of happiness and beauty can, more than any other state of mind, cause suicide. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, wars were necessary to balance excess of energy that poured out of the soul. The terrace was closed, so no one would ever feel such splendor again. Evita felt she had been taught a lesson so subtle it could not be shared. And the last sentences are, she took the first flight, his body followed later in a warship. The end. Translation mine because I couldn't get hold of the English copy. Sorry. More than adding private knowledge, Eva Lopo's memories highlight what history does not know. Although it is impossible to know everything that happens, it is also true that only certain private events are always deemed non-historical and kept out of the historical narrative. The Murmuring Coast brings no historical truth claims to the novel, much less to the history of Portugal's colonial war. What it does is, again, provide a different kind of knowledge of the pervasiveness of violence, the way it invades every corner and crevice in the domestic realm where the women and the children lived. There is no objective account, and yet this need not affect truth. It shows how different people and stories, often marginal, contribute to history and make it richer. So, Os Cus de Judas and A Costa dos Murmúrios are both memory novels in the sense that both use memory as a narrative device. Someone remembers and narrates. Other than that, they make very different uses of memory. Lobo Antunes uses memory aiming at a catharsis, while Lydia Jorge confronts us with this deconstruction of the official account, and she just leaves it at that. It is up to the reader to piece together what happened. The novel was adapted to the screen by Margarida Cardoso, and I will play a short excerpt from Eva Lopo's account so you can have a better idea of what I am trying to say. Evita and Luís Alex joined his commander and his wife Helena on a trip along the coast.
Quer que lhe conte o que se passou nos dias seguintes? Mas de que serve relembrar agora um tempo que todos fizemos ao longo destes anos, um esforço tão grande para esquecer?
Deixa estar.
Agora a Helena vai adivinhar o que é que está aqui.
É uma peça do motor do barco.
Não?
É uma mesa de piquenique desmontada.
Então, tu sabes.
Não, não sei.
Sabe sim. Olha. Uma Star. Calibre 9.
Não quero ver, já sabes que eu tenho medo.
É, volta aqui. Um tipo atingido por esta brincadeira. Até levanta voo. E esta aqui, o que é?
Um Winchester.
E esta?
Uma Kalash.
Agora olha bem.
Okay, they then go off and shoot flamingos. In her account, which you know by now is also dark, Eva Lopo oscillates always between the will to remember and the will to forget, and she talks about it at the beginning of the excerpt I played. But even when wanting to forget, the ghosts and shadows of the past haunt her. Forgetting is as much part of memory as is remembering. We can never remember everything, and that what we remember and forget changes over time. Marc Auger compares the line that separates remembering from forgetting to the shoreline that separates the land of remembrance from the sea of forgetfulness. The shoreline is never fixated and advances and recedes with the tides. Ebb reveals memories once covered by the sea of forgetfulness, and events are always only temporarily submerged. But not forgetting can lead to resentment, and forgetting is politically important. It is inscribed very often in peace treaties. For example, in the peace treaty of Westphalia that put an end to the 30-Year War, still the most violent and deadly war ever fought on European soil. Perpetua oblivio et amnesia are invoked. To overcome war's atrocities and make peace, we have to forget. What happens too is that when we decide to forget, the trauma is not attended and the wounds do not heal. For that, we need to remember. So this oscillation between remembering and forgetting, here culture plays a role because it allows us to understand the other, to not forget and to repair, but it does so in a long-term process, which also is low intensity. Other reparation processes, for example, economical reparation, provoke high-intensity debates. But cultural reparation can bridge and mediate between forgetting and remembering. I would argue it is a kind of soft power that helps understanding the other and healing the wounds that never heal by merely forgetting, and, which we now know, are generationally transmitted for a very long time. Let's move on. There is a famous quote by Audre Lorde: "Revolution is not a one-time event." It goes on like this: "It is becoming always vigilant for the smallest opportunity to make genuine change in established outgrown responses. For instance, it is learning to address each other's difference with respect." So now I would like to draw your attention to a group of artists who have been, contemporary artists, who have been prolonging the revolution by looking at creations by artists who reflect, for example, the point of view of the colonized. Vasco Araújo is one of those artists, as are Felipe César and Grada Quilomba. Araújo's short film Parque Temático is an 8-minute film that casts a critical look at a very famous and well-liked theme park named Portugal dos Pequenitos. On the surface, this theme park is a cute playground with child-sized miniature replicas of Portuguese architecture, including various monuments. We all loved going there, took our children, and probably will take our grandchildren. But there's always a but. At the entrance stands quite conspicuously the section dedicated to the overseas possessions. No way to walk around it. As they were called, the overseas possessions it's what they were called then. The park was conceived by Bissaia Barreto and built in 1940 and the 50s and 60s, but conceived at the same time as the Exposição do Mundo Português, an exhibition that celebrated the Portuguese Empire at a time Europe was at war. Given the context and Bissaia Barreto's politics, a zero-hour ardent supporter of Salazar, it was to become the playground of the future men and women of the Estado Novo. That was the educational aim. Now, Barreto was also a very important and in some respects progressive innovator, and with a very important role in developing psychiatric, maternity and childcare in the area of Coimbra. And this really complicates this place even more. But its aesthetics and its politics are far from innocent. The park is a celebration of a grandiose empire and equally Salazaristic, a rural, modest, idyllic society at home. In his short film, all Araújo does is making the oversized statues of Black Africans speak, as these figures still reflect, in the 21st century, without any context or explanation, the colonial mindset that saw the Black African as the embodiment of Africa's wilderness and as people with no history or language of their own. They are the only people represented in the park as a race. They had the status of indigenous people who did not have the same rights as the civilized and the assimilated, and exploitation like forced labor was legal in the colonies. In the film, the figures ask themselves why the hell they are in this place, where they are the only human beings displayed among objects, and they discuss what they mean to the gaze of the visitor. So here's some of the things they say. So with this, Araújo merely wants to ask why they are still giving no context, except that which the Estado Novo considered to be their natural position in God's world. The artist doesn't wish to dismantle or destroy the statues or close the park, but he insists on asking these questions and with it suggests that it be somehow reframed. These are exactly the gestures that culture can contribute with for this slow and peaceful repair work, because it makes a difference for a Black child who visits the park in school visits. A different story needs to be told. Until recently, the memories of the colonized peoples have been quite invisible in Portugal, a country where the maritime expansion is celebrated in an acritical way. And yet 160,000 Portuguese-speaking Africans live in Portugal. There are post-colonial studies, yes, there are voices, there's a discussion, but it is taking time. And the fact that these 160,000 Africans in Portugal now have tens of thousands that are studying in the universities or already hold a degree is changing the conversation and accelerating the discussion. So according to a recent study carried out by ICSTE in Lisbon University, just over 72,000 higher education students between 2015 and 2021 were from the PALOP countries, the African Portuguese-speaking countries. While this accounts for 3 point something of all students, the increase is significant, especially in the case of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, with Guinea-Bissau advancing from last to first, with an increase of over 900% of students. A young generation of Africans is questioning the status quo and asking the uncomfortable questions that is changing the conversation and will eventually lead to a reckoning with the colonial past. They question, for example, why they never came across the name of Amílcar Cabral in their history books in Portugal. And I ask why my children, who went to high school after 2000, have not learned anything about the massacres perpetrated in 1953 in Batupá or 1972 in Viriamu in their Portuguese history courses. The interdisciplinary Portuguese writer and artist Grada Quilomba is best known for her large-scale installation The Boat. This sculpture addresses the history of European maritime expansion and colonization. Grada Quilomba's sculpture invites the audience to consider forgotten stories and identities. It is a counter-monument that evokes the legacy of slavery, and in the words of the Financial Times, it was exhibited in London, makes us mourn and heal. But in the short film Conakry, directed by Filipa César, she asks exactly the question I was mentioning before. Conakry is a long sequence shot that documents an exhibition curated by Amílcar Cabral at the Palais du Peuple, the People's Palace, in 1972 in Conakry, where the liberation movement PAIGC was operating from and which reported the state of the war against Portuguese colonial rule. For the film, César invited, among others, Grada Quilomba to reflect on these images and their history. Here I will move forward.
That is Grada Quilomba, the Portuguese writer. She will share her readings of particular footage from this archive.
I have to explain, so Filipa César found archive footage that was in very bad state, so many images don't have soundtrack, and there's soundtracks without images. You will see.
Decolonization, what a beautiful word, written in images, picture by picture, a visual language portrayed in each one of these reels. Here cinema becomes a decolonial act.
In 1956, Amílcar Cabral founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. For 11 years, he led the armed resistance to Portuguese colonialism. This West African struggle ended in 1974 with the fall of the Portuguese dictatorship. This is the People's Palace in Conakry. In 1967, this Congress Center was partly a gift from China to the People's Revolutionary Republic of Guinea.
I am speaking because the sounds belonging to these images have not arrived yet. Maybe they never will. What I speak and have to say may never be what these reels want to tell, but I tell you and I reassure you that the name Amílcar Cabral was never revealed to me in my history books, nor mentioned in my classroom in Lisbon, where other Black children and I sat in the back. My memories are not sweet, though they could have been. They could have been memories of pride if these images have been shown to me earlier before.
But there's also this. The maths bitch made all the returnees sit in the row furthest from the window, in the worst lit seats. She must think we're like mother's roses, that we will wilt without sunlight. That must be it. Can one of the returnees answer the question? The bitch never says our names. Is it so hard to say my name? If I were called Kijibanganga, she might have an excuse. But Rui, for fuck's sake, it's such an easy name. And even if I were called Kijibanganga, it's the bitch's duty to learn it. Again, students in the back row. Here we come across the same grievances. A different story, same grievances. Being seated in the worst row of the classroom, having no name, not being recognized, let alone respected as a singular human being. This time the complaint comes from a 15-year-old returnee whose parents had been settlers in Angola, and from Dulce Maria Cardoso's novel, The Return, translated into English by Angel Gurria Quintana. In a short preface, he sums up the context of the returnees, and I will quote a few sentences. In the run-up to formal statehood, 500,000 Portuguese citizens were forced to flee their homes and farms in Angola, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. In the weeks before Angola's independence, up to 4,000 of these evacuees landed daily in Lisbon and Porto, as Angola prepared for its formal independence. In The Return, Dulce Maria Cardoso draws on her own experience as an 11-year-old returnee, but this is where the similarity with her own experience stops. She uses a boy as a narrator, and thus she separates the narrator from the author, which makes it literarily much more interesting and credible. It improves the fictional qualities of the novel, and it makes it universal, more universal. The boy renders an unforgiving flow of consciousness that makes the reader uncomfortable, but able to understand how frightened and out of place he feels, and how unhospitable the motherland was. This unwelcoming Europe, of course, echoes today, and the attitudes we are having with refugees and migrants. The Return shows us another side of the discomfort of the Portuguese colonial question. Margarida Calafate Ribeiro argues that the old regime wanted to show Portugal and its colonies as a sea of tranquility, while the new government after the revolution, the new governments wanted to avoid the subject out of shame and embarrassment. The legacy was too painful and explosive, and everybody wanted to forget, resulting in a veil of silence that still surrounds everything related to empire, colonial war, and post-colonialism. The voices of the returnees or returned have always been contested. They were identified with colonialism and exploitation, and many thought they deserved their fate. Others were afraid of the new and more liberal customs they would bring from the colonies, women and girls showing more skin than in the mainland. Like Rui's sister in the novel, they were avoided because they had had contact with black boys and black men. They were sullied. The returnees were also held responsible for the increase in drug consumption and thought to have been a doorway for liamba, the Portuguese word, the African Portuguese word for pot. The returnees, on the other hand, were disillusioned with the motherland, the metrópole, which Maria Dulce Cardoso never writes with a capital M, and about which they had fantasized before. The novel starts, but there are cherries in the motherland, big glossy cherries that the girls wear like earrings, pretty girls, like only those from the motherland can be. These are the first lines of The Return, but when Rui arrives with his mother and sister, the father has stayed behind and his fate is only revealed in the last pages of the novel, there are no words for his disappointment. Cardoso expresses it by using one single sentence to bridge the chaotic boarding of the plane in Luanda and the welcome speech of the hotel owner once they are in the hotel where they will languish for months, if not years. 6 words on an otherwise blank page. So this is the motherland, then. I think I will jump this one.
I'm Angel Gurria Quintana.
Dulce Maria Cardoso said in an interview that she realized only while already writing that in Portuguese, ruir is the imperative of the verb ruir, to collapse. And it is indeed a collapse that Rui describes: his world, his home country, the motherland, his youth. His description of the offices of Jarn, the government agency that supported the returnees, captures this ruin. There were returnees from every corner of the empire. The empire was there in that waiting room, a tired empire, in need of house and food, a defeated and humiliated empire, an empire no one wanted to know about. I'm not the first one to notice and find out that this description perfectly echoes the re-nation in the photo taken by Alfredo da Cunha, which is here in our exhibition of the photos of Alfredo da Cunha. That is a sister exhibition to the one of the revolution. The piled up crates and containers with the belongings and the memories of the returnees are a stark contrast with the monument, which at that time also looked quite ruinous, because in the meantime it has been restored and looks very new and clean. In the words of Senor Belchior, one of the guests in the hotel, the containers are remains of the empire, and it is not without irony that they are where it all started. Thank you for listening. And I hope you have questions. I try to leave it as open as possible, and I hope you have some questions, some remarks, and some critiques to make. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I thought it was really interesting and food for thought and reflection on the way you explain how memory works and forgetfulness. But I'm Portuguese too, so as you know, and I was particularly impacted by this excerpt where the fact that Amilcar Cabral wasn't mentioned in the books, and you mentioned your kids didn't hear about any of this after 2000. I haven't either. I'm older. Do you happen to know if this is still the case? Do you happen to know if in the curricula these names of
I don't know. I don't know. I suspect not. Because for this to happen, the discussion has to advance into many different instances and offices until school manuals are changed. So of course you had it after the revolution. So there was colonialism and it was bad, and then there was the decolonization. Full stop, and that's the end of the story. And for this to change, it will take time. And I think that only now the conversation has become public. Until now, it was in some circles, academia, progressive left-wing politics, but it has not hit the mainstream. But now I think at least the mainstream is being hit with it. Let's see what happens.
Just another one on that as well. There's this, I think most Portuguese are convinced that they are not racist, as if racism was not a structure that depends on hierarchies and exploitation. And what I notice, I don't know if you agree, is that whenever this conversation is started about racism in Portugal in newspapers, the comment section is hideous. So there's people who will absolutely refuse to acknowledge that there are racist structures, that there is racism, a bit of the heritage of this idea of lusotropicalism. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is improving somewhat? Will we overcome this? Will we attain a point when we'll be able to have a civilized discussion about this?
I don't know. In the current political climate in all of Europe, I really don't know. I hope so. I think in Portugal there are two things. I'm sorry, I cannot see the faces. Can I sit here, or do I ruin the recording? Yes, I ruined the recording, of course, because I have no mic. It's okay. So, yes, there's this myth of the lusotropicalism. But there is a part that is not a myth, and let me finish the sentence before, before you walk out screaming. And this has to do that, I mean, colonialism proper started in 1880. That's when colonizers went en masse and settlers went en masse to all the colonies, in all countries, all the European countries. And Portugal was, let's say it in simply, Portugal was an underdog at the end of the 19th century. So Portugal was a horrible colonizer, an ineffective colonizer, and being colonized itself by the hegemonies, if you want, of the main colonizing countries, mainly the UK. And remember the problems we had with the UK, the pink map, also because the UK saved us from the Napoleonic invasions when the Portuguese armies had really already done the job, and so on. So there's, and Boaventura Sousa Santos writes about that, and it's maybe the most interesting thing he's written, that, and he makes a comparison with Prospero and Caliban, and that Portugal is really, I mean, the Africans are Caliban, and Portugal is a Prospero, but is a Calibanized Prospero, because the real Prospero is the UK. So he makes this image, and this, I think, this in part plays into this idea that of lusotropicalismo, because in some aspects the Portuguese colonialism might have been different, not better, different, and that's the big difference with lusotropicalismo. So yes, and well, the racist conversations. Yes, we need to. People need to admit that in a way we are all racists. The difference is that you check yourself and admit it, or you don't admit it. We all have prejudices. But it will take time. I think it will take some time. I know some of these people, and I know it's very difficult to talk to them. But hopefully, yes, one day.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, maybe you don't know neither, but as Portuguese, I went to the Portugal dos Pequeninos with the school in the 90s. And for me, it's like crazy imagining that nowadays we still don't have a contextualization while children go there and visit with the school. And I was wondering if you know if this is changing too, if the way professors, teachers talk with children is changing or not. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to offend primary school teachers, but I think primary school, it's not the job of primary school teachers, and I don't think they know enough history. Only if they have a special interest would they know. It's of course the obligation of Fundação Bissaia Barreto. They have been doing some things. It's still very superficial and more cosmetic than anything else. But they heard the critiques, because this film by Vasco Araújo, it was a big scandal, because he wanted to make the film and the Fundação Bissaia Barreto didn't allow him to film. And so then this appeared in the media, and the Ministry of Culture intervened, and then they let him in, and he made the film. And he exhibited his film, because it was probably a commission for some art fair or exhibition, with a black screen, which of course was horrible for the Fundação Bissaia Barreto, and so they changed it. And very often I think there is a real misunderstanding. That's why I took trouble to say he doesn't want any iconoclasm. He doesn't want to destroy it. He doesn't want to even badmouth it. He's just asking questions. It's legitimate to ask questions. and to ask these questions. So yes, they know they're being criticized and they're doing some superficial changes.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I have a question, I don't know, it's for you or also for the curators of the exhibition. We talk about memory with almost a fifth of the population of Luxembourg having Portuguese descent. I also never heard about the Portuguese Revolution in school, for example. I was born here, so it's a memory that I acquired with time and not through school. How were Luxembourgish schools involved in this exhibition? Were they? Was there a special interest, and was there a special aim to also bring this memory closer to students with Portuguese descent or with descent of Portuguese colonies? Yeah, I don't know who.
So I think the question is also, as you said, to the curators. Actually, as a museum, we have not real tight links to the educational system. We offer visits, guided tours, where also I think, Vera, you made some, as a guide also, some discussions with students that were very interesting in the exhibition. But for this exhibition, I don't know yet how many registrations we have for the months coming. But also it's an offer that I personally found not as much teachers used up until now. But we will see in the first quarter of the new school year. That was also one of the reasons why we wanted that the exhibition lasts until after Christmas. To have the first trimester of the new year within that. Sometimes we have exhibitions where afterwards the Commission des Programmes use things out of the exhibition to offer a toolbox for teachers to integrate in their lessons. For this exhibition, that hasn't yet been the case. But we are always there to help for doing that. But our mission as a museum, and also with the resources we have for such exhibition, is I think it's good when we do exhibitions, when we try to make a very large program around it, like talks, conferences, discussion rounds, and also a pedagogical program also aimed for this exhibition more to secondary schools than to other exhibitions more aimed at primary schools, but this is more aimed at secondary schools. And we know it's sometimes very difficult, more difficult in secondary schools than in primary schools to get pupils and students in the museum for logistical reasons. But yeah, that's maybe it will go into school, but it wasn't also it was neither in the Portuguese school here in Luxembourg. It's also topics that are not discussed as less as in the Luxembourgish school. I think there's even one manual here in Luxembourg speaking of the Carnation Revolution taking place in Spain. So the not knowing in some places is quite hard. And I think, yeah, but it's 50 years afterwards, maybe you have more interest for it, and it maybe will change. And today in the educational program, also in Luxembourg, it's very dependent on the teachers, which they use what they used at the time to go be off more wide than the program imposes. But no, there is no real implication with school except the offer that I just told. But there are also, if I would be a history teacher, there's today such a large offer of things, such different topics you could integrate in your lessons that I hope that most of them adapt that to the students they have in front of them. But I think, and Vera, we talked some weeks ago about a discussion you had with the secondary class, yes, where there were the students from Cape Verdean descent, from Portuguese descent, and coming from Syria. The discussions that you had with the students were very interesting, I think.
Yes, it was very interesting. We had, of course, opening end of April. There were not that many visits at the end of the school year. But I had a couple of schools that I guided through the exhibition. They always had Portuguese or Portuguese-speaking students, either from Portugal or from the former colonies, or their background from the former colonies. And I wrote a short article for the next Museo Mag about that. So we had an African student who suddenly out of the blue said, yes, my father was in prison in Angola, and his classmate asked, but why? He said, nothing, he didn't do anything, that's how it was. And then this memory prompted other memories with the teacher saying, here it's a smaller group with and I can identify the teacher then said, my grandfather was a prisoner in a gulag and he never talked about it. And so you see how also memories, one memory makes another memory come, and they're always productive memories, and they're never exclusive to one subject or one situation. So yes, I mean, I would really like it that all these students come, and you said it very subtly, Regis, that history teachers, well, we hope they have the pupils and students that they have in mind and adapt the extra topics that they do in history class to the students they have. And we know how many Portuguese students are sitting in the classes. Let's hope it picks up.
And okay, one more question.
So actually, also for the memories of the Carnation Revolution, you didn't talk that much about some other kinds of memories. I think that also sometimes, at least in the political discourse, in the last years appears more often that actually it was better before the Carnation Revolution, to put it a bit provocatively. Do you see that there are changes on how the Salazar regime is seen today than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago in Portugal?
Okay, I think at a certain level, one thing happened is that the discussion in some circles got more informed and less emotional. I mean, like, when I was a teenager and just after the revolution, it was like, oh, yes, Salazar was good. Why? Because yes. And the other side was saying, no, 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 it was horrible. Why? Because yes, because it was horrible, because I know. And there was not a lot of information, especially when young people were discussing. I mean, we grow up individually, and I believe that as societies, we also grow up. I mean, the country learned to be democratic, and for now, the democracy is a real success story of the Portuguese Revolution, and I think Portuguese are very democratic, and as democratic as any other European. So they have learned it. With racism and the colonial question, things take more time, and this hasn't happened yet. But on the other hand, as we know, there is an extreme right-wing surge everywhere, and so is in Portugal. I mean, in the last elections, we woke up to the shock that instead of having 8, I mean, I really tried hard to forget, instead of having 8, we have 45 deputies from the extreme right-wing party. So this is a phenomenon that is happening everywhere. It's particularly shocking in Portugal because it was not that long ago. nevertheless, there were some observations also sometimes of children who were really still children and who said, there is a film by, I don't remember his name now, Fantasia Lusitana. And it is about this exhibition in 1940, the Mundo Português. And it is very, very, very ironic, but it is so ironic and so sophisticated that 99% of the people don't get the point. And so it was really not very successful. João Canijo is the name of the filmmaker. But I was watching it, and I remember there were my children, there were others, they were really kids, they were 10, 8. And they were seeing it, and I tried to explain. I said, oh no, but it's nice. It's also clean, and it's also pretty, and it's also, so the aesthetics appeal. And so there are many, many ways that fascistic thought, fascistic politics, poetics, aesthetics, that they can invade the mind of people. But I mean, more and more Salazar biographies are coming out, and all different. And I think that is very positive, because you really get to know the man if you read more than one.
Do we have
any more questions?
Any other question? Now is the time. Okay, I think then we can conclude the evening. Thank you again, Vera, for your talk and
Thank you. Thank
the
you
great
very
replies
much.
to all the questions. I also want to just quickly remind you that we have a very extensive program next to the talk here tonight. Next week, exactly 1 week from now, we will have a table ronde. We will have a roundtable about the consequences of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal and in Luxembourg. And we announced it with that we have Manuel Malheiros, José Rebelo, and Serge Kohlwalter on the panel. We also have Antonio Paiva on the panel, and we actually have one wheel, Capitaine d'Avril, on the panel. We will have Mr. Antonio Rosado da Luz on the panel, talking about his the way he was involved in the planning and the execution of the revolution itself, because he was stationed in Cascais that day itself. So I all invite you to come to the table ronde. It's next week at the Casino in Bonnevoie. So thank you for coming tonight, and hope to see you next week too.